The blizzard came without warning, which was the cruelest thing about it, and Ghorza Bloodhorn was 3 miles from the clan hall when the sky turned white. She had been tracking a wounded elk through the pine forest on the eastern ridge, following the dark thread of blood through snow that had been ankle-deep and manageable when she set out that morning. By midday, the wind had changed. By the time the elk's trail vanished beneath a fresh curtain of falling snow, the storm had graduated from inconvenience to something far more serious, and Ghorza was experienced enough in these mountains to know the difference. She pulled her fur wrap tighter around her shoulders and turned back toward home, moving quickly, reading the land beneath her feet the way her mother had taught her. But the land had disappeared. Every ridge looked like every other ridge. Every cluster of pines stood like a silent, identical sentinel in the white chaos. The temperature was dropping fast, and the cold was the gnawing, marrow-deep kind that did not negotiate. She had made perhaps a mile of progress, or what she believed was a mile, when she found the trapper's line. The rope was strung low between two old birch trees, marking a boundary she recognized not by sight but by instinct, and her heart sank in her chest like a stone dropped into frozen water. She had drifted south, significantly south. She was on the boundary between Bloodhorn land and the human settlements along the Grayville foothills, which meant she was not 3 miles from the clan hall but closer to 6, and 6 miles in this storm was not a journey. It was a death sentence. She pressed her back against one of the birch trees and let herself think clearly for exactly 30 seconds. That was something her father, old Chief Durek Bloodhorn, had always insisted upon. 30 seconds of clear thought before panic. She used them well. She was not dressed for a full blizzard. Her fur wrap was good quality, cured elk hide lined with wolf fur, but it was a hunting wrap, not a cold-weather cloak, and it covered her shoulders and torso but left her arms and lower legs exposed. She was wearing thick leather breeches tucked into knee-high boots, but her boots were already wet through at the seams. She had flint and tinder in her belt pouch, but there was nothing dry enough to burn within reach. She had a half-full water skin and the dried meat she'd brought for the hunt. She could dig herself into a snow shelter, which was the old survival method, but the trees here were too sparse to provide adequate windbreak, and the storm showed no sign of easing. She counted to 30. Then she heard the axe. It was faint, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere downhill and to her left. The sound of wood being split. Human sound, she thought, her jaw tightening instinctively, because humans along the Grayville foothills were not known for their warmth toward Bloodhorn orcs. There had been an uneasy truce for the past several years between her clan and the settlement at Harrow's Crossing, but a truce was not friendship, and she was aware of exactly how she looked to human eyes. She stood nearly 6 feet tall. Her skin was the deep, moss-shadowed green of a forest at dusk. Her tusks were prominent, not the small, polite nubs of some mixed-blood orcs, but true tusks, curving up from her lower jaw the way her grandmother's had, the way that marked her as pure Bloodhorn stock, which her clan considered a point of pride, and which human settlers along the frontier tended to consider something quite different. She was broad-shouldered and strong, her black hair braided back severely from her face, and her amber eyes caught light the way a cat's eyes did, which she had been told by more than one human was unsettling. She stood in the snow and listened to the axe fall, and she thought about pride, and then she thought about freezing to death, and then she started walking toward the sound. The woodpile materialized from the white storm like something conjured. It was stacked higher than her head, good split pine and ash, and the man working it was standing with his back to her, driving an axe through a round of wood with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had been doing this for many years. He was tall for a human, she noticed, nearly matching her own height, with broad shoulders under a heavy wool coat the color of old charcoal. His hair was dark brown and disheveled by the wind. He was young mid-20s, she estimated, and she could see from his stance that he was strong. She stopped at the edge of the woodpile and said, loudly enough to carry over the wind, "Human." He turned fast. The axe came up in a defensive reflex, which she respected, because a man who did not react to a stranger's voice behind him was a fool, and fools did not survive long on the frontier. His eyes found her, and she watched the sequence play out across his face the way she had watched it play out across so many human faces before. Surprise, recognition of what she was, a complicated arrangement of instincts that humans were generally not trained to manage gracefully. But then something else. He lowered the axe. He looked at her properly, the way a person looked at another person, not the way a person looked at a threat, and she saw his eyes move over her with the quick, methodical assessment of someone taking stock of a situation. He took in the fact that her lips were already going bluish at the corners. He took in her wet boots. He took in the hunting wrap that was simply not enough. "How long have you been out in this?" he asked. "Long enough," she said, and her voice was steady because Bloodhorn women did not let their voices waver, not even when their fingers were going numb inside their gloves. He set the axe against the woodpile and said, "Come inside." She did not move immediately. "I am Bloodhorn clan," she said, which was a warning and an identification at once, and she said it because she wanted him to know exactly who he was inviting in before he invited her, so that there could be no complaint afterward. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "I know. My name is Warren Watkins. I'm the trapper who works this southern ridge. You're welcome in my cabin, and I mean that sincerely, so please come inside before you lose those fingers." She looked at his hands. They were bare, red from the cold, and he had been chopping wood in this blizzard, which meant he was either very dedicated or very stubborn. She suspected both. She followed him. His cabin was small but built correctly. That was the first thing she noticed. The walls were thick, the chinking between the logs done with care and packed moss and river clay, not the quick crumbling mortar of a man who did not intend to stay. The fireplace was wide-mouthed and generous, with a fire already burning in it that heated the space quickly and thoroughly. There was a single room with a sleeping pallet in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a series of shelves holding trapping equipment, dried herbs, sealed clay jars, and tools. Pelts hung from the ceiling beams, drying. The place smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and tallow, and it was warm, and the warmth hit her like a wave. She stood near the door, dripping snowmelt onto the packed earth floor, and Warren Watkins moved past her without ceremony to put another log on the fire. "Sit down," he said, nodding at the chair nearest the hearth. "I do not need to sit. Your boots are soaked through and your lips are blue," he said, not unkindly. "You need to sit, get those boots off, and warm your feet. Pride won't prevent frostbite." He paused and looked at her over his shoulder. "Though I suspect you know that already. You're just deciding whether you trust me enough to be vulnerable in my space." That was a perceptive thing to say. She studied him more carefully. He had a lean, angular face, honest rather than handsome, with a scar running through his left eyebrow that suggested he had survived something at some point. His eyes were a warm gray-brown, the color of river stones in autumn, and they were steady in the way that suggested a person who was comfortable with silence and with difficult circumstances. He looked at her without the particular kind of wariness that she was accustomed to seeing in human faces, and she could not quite determine whether that was because he had experience with orcs or because he was simply not a man who defaulted to wariness. She sat down. She pulled off her boots with stiff fingers and set them near the fire. Warren Watkins, without asking, went to one of his shelves and produced a pair of thick wool socks which he handed to her without comment, and then he went to the fire and began heating water in an iron pot. "I do not require," she began. "It's for tea," he said. "I require it. You can share if you want." She put the socks on. They were too large for her feet and extraordinarily warm. She watched him move around the small cabin, aware that he was making a deliberate point of not hovering over her, not watching her, giving her space to settle without the pressure of constant observation. It was a thoughtful thing to do. She was not accustomed to thoughtfulness from humans. How did you drift this far south? He asked, his back to her, measuring dried herbs into 2 clay cups. I was tracking a wounded elk, lost the trail when the storm changed. Comes fast off the Ashbeak Range, he said. Did the same to me my first winter here. I followed a marten trail for 2 hours in the wrong direction before I realized the landmarks were all wrong. He glanced at her. I know this feels like charity, and I suspect you're not comfortable with charity. But you weren't going to make the clan hall tonight. Not in this. I know that. Then we agree. He set a cup on the table beside her. The tea smelled of dried elderflower and something warming she couldn't quite name. Drink that, it'll help. She drank it. It was good. She did not tell him it was good, but she drank the whole cup, and when he refilled it without asking, she did not refuse. The storm continued outside, pressing against the walls with a sound like something enormous breathing. The fire crackled and shifted. Warren Watkins sat across the table from her and wrapped both hands around his own cup, and she had the peculiar experience of sitting in almost comfortable silence with a human man she had met 20 minutes ago. "You're Ghorza," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him sharply. "You know my name." "I trade furs in Harrow's Crossing during the autumn market," he said. "I've seen you there twice. You negotiate for your clan's winter supplies with the general merchant Aldrich something. Aldrich Brent. Yes, you're a hard negotiator. Everyone at the market talks about it." She considered this. "What do they say?" He smiled then, a small, crooked thing that changed his face considerably. "Mostly that they're glad they're not on the opposite side of the table from you. That is a compliment. I meant it as one." She looked at him steadily. "And yet you invited me in." "Of course I did," he said, and he sounded genuinely puzzled by the idea that he might have done anything else. "You were going to freeze. What sort of person would I be if I didn't?" The storm kept them there for 2 full days. It was, Ghorza thought later, one of the stranger experiences of her adult life, stranger even than the time she had helped deliver twins in the back of a supply wagon, or the time she had talked a drunk human soldier out of starting a brawl during the autumn trade fair. 2 days confined with a human trapper in a one-room cabin on the edge of the Ashbeak wilderness, while the blizzard did its worst outside and the world narrowed down to firelight, and the smell of wood smoke, and the slow, tentative process of 2 very different people learning that they were not as different as they had assumed. Warren Watkins was 26 years old. He told her this on the evening of the first day, when the conversation had moved from weather and tracking to the more personal territory that long confinements tend to produce. He had come to the Grayville foothills 4 years earlier from a farming settlement much further east, near the Thornwall garrison, where his father had worked as a blacksmith. He had 2 older brothers and a younger sister. He had learned trapping from an old man named Curran who had worked the mountain lines for 40 years and who had, Warren said, a gift for patience that bordered on the supernatural. "He told me the most important thing about trapping is knowing when not to set a trap," Warren said. He was mending a section of rope by firelight, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of long habit. "Knowing when the moment isn't right, when to wait." "The same is true of hunting," Ghorza said. She was sitting on the floor near the fire, her back against the stone hearth, examining one of his traps with the professional curiosity of someone who understood engineering. It was a good design, she thought, simple and well-weighted. "My father taught me that the animal always tells you when the time is right. You only have to be quiet enough to hear it. Your father sounds like he knew what he was doing. He was a good hunter and a better chief," she said. "He died 3 years ago. A fever in the spring, it came quickly." "I'm sorry," Warren said, and there was nothing in his voice except the plainness of the statement which she appreciated more than elaborate condolences would have been. "Thank you," she said, and then because fairness demanded it, "Have you lost anyone?" "My mother," he said. "When I was 15, a hard winter and she was already weak." He paused. "And old Curran 2 years ago, not unexpected but still." "It is never expected, really," she said. "Even when you see it coming?" "No," he agreed, "it never is." She learned in those 2 days that he read when he could. keeping a small collection of books on a shelf beside his bed, histories, and a volume of frontier cartography, and something that appeared to be a collection of folk songs from the eastern settlements. She learned that he was a better cook than she had expected, producing a surprisingly good venison stew from smoked meat and dried vegetables and herbs that he kept in a clay jar labeled carefully in his own handwriting. She learned that he was funny in a quiet way, dry and understated, the kind of humor that crept up on you and made you laugh before you had decided whether you were going to. She learned that he looked at her, not in the way she was accustomed to being looked at by humans, which was with suspicion or studied neutrality or occasionally the particular kind of avoidance that was more telling than direct staring. Warren Watkins looked at her with a frank and uncomplicated attention that she found, to her considerable discomfort, not unwelcome. He looked at her when she spoke. He looked at her when she was quiet, too, when she was reading the frost patterns on his window, or examining the quality of a pelt, or simply watching the fire think its orange thoughts. There was no performance in it. He was simply paying attention to her, the way a person paid attention to something they found genuinely interesting. She was not accustomed to being found genuinely interesting by anyone outside her clan. On the morning of the second day, she woke before him and stood at the cabin window watching the storm continue its assault on the world. The snow was thigh-deep in the open ground beyond the woodpile. The wind had dropped somewhat, which she recognized as the storm's pause before its second act. She was considering the state of her boots, which had dried somewhat, and the state of her supplies, which were adequate, and the state of her own feelings, which were considerably less easy to assess, when she heard Warren stir behind her. "Still bad?" he asked. "The wind is lower, but the storm isn't finished," she said. She heard him get up, heard the sounds of morning water poured from a jug, the fire stoked, the quiet movements of a man at home in his own small space. He came to stand beside her at the window, not crowding her, just standing close enough that she was aware of his presence as a warmth that was separate from the fires. "Another day," he said. It was not a complaint. "Another day," she agreed, and then, because it was honest, "I have not been imprisoned." He smiled at that. "Good, neither have I." She looked at him sideways. The morning light was thin and gray from the snow-covered window, and it did something interesting to the planes of his face. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A man who would give me a blanket and a corner and as much distance as the room allowed." He considered this. "You expected me to be afraid of you." "Most humans are." "I've lived beside this mountain for 4 years," he said. "I've seen bloodhorn hunting parties crossing the South Ridge in the early mornings. I've found your clan's trail markers in the deep forest. I've heard the drums from the hall on winter solstice nights." He was quiet for a moment. "I've traded goods at the same market as Bloodhorn clan members for 3 autumns running. I've watched your people, and I've watched my people, and I've thought for a long time that the distance between them is mostly made of fear and ignorance rather than anything real." He looked at her directly. "You're a person. You're cold and stranded and unexpectedly excellent at explaining trapping mechanics. I don't see what there is to be afraid of." "My tusks," she said. "My height, the color of my skin. The fact that Bloodhorn clan fought human settlers in this valley 30 years ago before the truce." 30 years ago," he said, "before either of us was born. History does not care about birth dates." "No," he agreed, "but I'm trying to care about the present." She turned back to the window. The snow was still falling, fine and relentless, and somewhere beneath it the world they both lived in was waiting to be navigated. "Your present includes a stranded orc woman in your cabin," she said. "I'm aware," he said, "and I find it considerably better than the alternative." On the afternoon of the second day, when the storm began truly easing, and the light took on the particular crystalline quality that follows a heavy snowfall, Ghorza made a decision. She had been thinking about it for several hours, testing it from different angles the way she tested the weight of a decision about the clan's trade negotiations or winter supplies, carefully from every side looking for the flaw. She could not find a flaw. "Warren," she said. He was at the table, charting something on a rough skin map, and he looked up with the attentiveness she was coming to expect from him. "I would like to continue this acquaintance." He set down his marking tool. "Tell me what that means to you," he said, "so I understand it correctly." "It means I would like to see you again," she said, "at the autumn market, or along the southern ridge line if our paths cross during the hunting season. I would like to not forget that you exist and simply file you away as the human trapper who saved my life in a blizzard." She paused. "I am not good at this," she said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in the 2 days of their acquaintance. "You're doing better than you think," he said, and then, "I would like that very much, Ghorza. I've been thinking, while you've been sitting there looking out the window, that I would very much not like to lose track of you either." "You have been thinking that?" "Since yesterday morning, honestly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is good," and went back to watching the storm finish its work, and she was aware, with a clarity that was mildly terrifying, that something had just shifted in the architecture of her life. She left the next morning. She dressed in her dried hunting wrap and her boots, and at the door she turned to say a proper farewell, and Warren lifted his heavy wool cloak from the peg beside the door and held it out to her without a word. It was a substantial thing, dark charcoal gray wool lined with rabbit fur, sized for a tall man and therefore generous enough to cover her properly, with a deep hood that would keep the wind from her face. "Your cloak," she said. "Take it," he said. "The weather is still cold and your wrap is a hunting wrap, not a cold weather cloak. I have a second coat, I'll be fine." "This is a good cloak," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Wear it in good health." She took it. She pulled it around her shoulders and over her hunting wrap, and the warmth of it was immediate and profound. It smelled like wood smoke and pine, like his cabin and his presence, and she was aware that she was wearing something of his around her body like an embrace, and she was aware that this observation was doing something quite dramatic to her composure. "Come to the autumn market," she said. "We will negotiate something, even if it is only tea." "I will be there," he said. "Watch the ridge lines coming home." She walked out into the white world, following the landmarks she now knew well enough in the brilliant post-storm clarity, and she walked with his cloak wrapped around her and his wood smoke smell against her skin, and she did not look back because she did not need to. She carried the weight of those 2 days with her like a stone in the pocket of her heart, solid and real and already deeply lodged. She was 2 miles from the clan hall when she passed the first of the Bloodhorn boundary markers, the carved stone pillars with the clan's Tuscan moon symbol, and she walked through the gates of the hall yard with her chin up, and the human trapper's cloak flowing around her shoulders like something between a flag and a declaration. She had known, on the walk home, that there would be this moment, had known it and prepared for it with the same methodical care with which she prepared for any negotiation or any hunt. The clan hall was the heart of Bloodhorn territory, a long, low-roofed structure of old pine and field stone, hung with trophy pelts and the battle honors of 4 generations. It was a place of pride and tradition, and the particular kind of shared memory that bound a clan together, and it was a place where human objects were not regarded warmly. There were perhaps a dozen clan members in the hall yard when she entered, hunters returning from the storm, youngsters helping clear snow from the firewood stores, old Merva at the well with her bucket, who had been at that well every morning for as long as Ghorza could remember. They all saw her. They all registered the cloak. The silence had that specific quality of something held very deliberately still. Brack was the one who spoke first, which surprised no one because Brack always spoke first. He was her cousin, 28 years old, a big, loud, combative male who was a good hunter and a terrible diplomat, and he said, "That is a human cloak, Ghorza," in the tone of someone announcing that a goat had wandered into the council fire. "It is," she said. She kept walking toward the hall doors. "Where did you get a human cloak?" "From a human," she said. The silence reconfigured itself into something with edges. She reached the hall doors and pulled one open with one hand, and she turned and looked back at the assembled members of her clan, Brack with his aggressive bewilderment, Merva with her bucket and her shrewd old eyes, the hunters and the youngsters and all the weight of shared tradition. And she looked at them calmly, wearing the gray wool cloak with the rabbit fur lining, and she did not explain herself, because a Bloodhorn woman did not explain herself, and she did not apologize, because she had nothing to apologize for. The trapper on the southern ridge, she said, clearly enough for everyone in the yard to hear. His name is Warren Watkins. He gave me shelter from the blizzard and his cloak for the walk home. He is a good man and a good neighbor, and if anyone in this clan has something to say about that, I invite them to say it to me directly. No one said anything. Old Merva, who had seen more of the world than anyone else in the hall yard, and who had survived 2 wars, a plague year, and the loss of 3 children, looked at Ghorza with those shrewd eyes of hers and made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite approval but was something private and knowing, and she turned back to her well. Ghorza went inside. She hung the cloak carefully on a peg in her quarters. She had a set of private rooms at the back of the hall, befitting her position as the chief negotiator of the clan and the eldest unmarried daughter of the late Chief Ghorza Bloodhorn. And she sat down on her sleeping bench and put her face in her hands and breathed very carefully for a long moment. Then she got up, because there was work to do, and she went to do it. And she did not think about gray-brown eyes or quiet voices or the smell of wood smoke for approximately 4 hours, which was, she felt, a considerable achievement. Spring came to the Grayville foothills slowly, as it always did in the shadow of the Ashpeak Range, retreating and returning like an uncertain traveler who could not quite commit to arrival. The snow melted in stages, the south-facing slopes clearing first, then the valley floors, and finally the high ridges giving up their white coats by late spring. The trees came back into leaf. The creeks ran fast and cold and urgent with snowmelt. The world smelled of mud and green things and possibility. Ghorza returned his cloak at the spring trade gathering in Harrow's Crossing, which was a smaller affair than the autumn market but a necessary one, when winter stores were assessed and early-season goods were exchanged. She had pressed the cloak the evening before, which was more preparation than she was comfortable acknowledging, and carried it folded under her arm. She found him at a stall on the eastern end of the market, selling winter pelts to a merchant from the lower valley. He looked well. The winter had put some weathering in his face that was not there before, but his eyes were the same, steady and warm, and when he saw her he stopped mid-sentence with the merchant and his face did something unguarded and genuine that she registered in her chest like a struck bell. "Ghorza," he said. "Warren Watkins," she said. She held out the cloak. "Thank you, it served its purpose." He took it, but he kept his eyes on her. "How was the winter?" "Long," she said. "And yours?" "The same." He paused. "Are you in Harrow's Crossing for the day?" "Yes." "Then have tea with me," he said, "when you're finished with your trading. The inn has a decent fire." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes," and felt the word settle into the ground between them like a seed. They sat in the inn that afternoon for 2 hours, and the conversation went to places that surprised her with its ease. She told him about the winter in the clan hall, about the apprentice hunters she was training, about the ongoing negotiations she was conducting with a merchant caravan from the southern passes about trade routes through Bloodhorn territory. He told her about a particularly brutal stretch of cold in late February that had frozen the creek line solid for 3 weeks, and about a wolf pack that had moved through the southern ridge and which he had watched rather than trapped, because they were magnificent and he had not wanted to break the pack. She asked him about the book of folk songs she had seen on his shelf, and he quoted her a verse from memory, his voice low and slightly self-conscious, and it was a good verse, about a river that remembered every stone it had passed, and she thought about it for a long time afterward. She told no one in the clan about the tea at the inn. This was not deception. She would have stated it plainly if asked. But she was a private person by nature, and what she was forming with Warren Watkins was tender and new and not ready to be examined by outside eyes. She was aware that she was doing something unusual. She was aware that the clan's opinion of human men, while not actively hostile, was complicated and often skeptical, and that her position as chief negotiator and a daughter of the old chief meant that her choices were observed and discussed in ways that an ordinary clan members would not be. She was aware of all of this, and she set it aside with the discipline she applied to all the other pressures of her life, because she was Ghorza Bloodhorn and she had never yet made a decision based on what other people found convenient. He came to the autumn market, as he had promised. By then it was September, and the forest was burning with its seasonal colors, and the market at Harrow's Crossing was full and loud and smelling of harvest goods and roasting meat, and the particular vitality of people coming together before the long quiet of winter. Ghorza was conducting clan business, negotiating a contract for salt and preserved fish and iron goods from a merchant consortium, when she saw Warren cross the market with a pack of pelts over one shoulder, and she felt her attention subdivide itself without her permission. She finished her negotiation. She was as precise and effective as she always was, which said something about the quality of her discipline that she was privately proud of. Then she went and found him at his usual stall. They had tea and then dinner at the inn that evening, and this time the conversation lasted 4 hours and moved through hunting and trade and clan history, and the political situation in the eastern frontier settlements, and a long, pleasant disagreement about whether elderflower or rosehip made the better winter tea, and she did not notice, until she was halfway back to the clan hall that evening, that she had been smiling for most of it. The second autumn market was where things changed. Not dramatically, because neither of them were dramatic people in that particular way, but the change was real, and it was significant, and she felt it. Warren had been at the market for 2 days before she arrived, which she knew because Aldrich Brent, the general merchant, mentioned it in passing during their first negotiation session, saying with elaborate casualness that the trapper from the southern ridge had been asking after her. She filed this information carefully and returned to the business of salt prices. When she found him that evening, they fell into conversation with the ease of people who had been doing it for a while, and there was a point, late in the evening, when the fire in the inn had burned down to coals and the room was quiet around them, when Warren set down his cup and said, without particular preamble, "I think about you, Ghorza, during the year, not just at the markets." She looked at him. "I know," she said, "you know. I think about you too," she said. I had assumed it was evident. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something settle and clarify in his face. "I'm not certain of the customs," he said carefully. "Between our peoples, I mean. I don't want to assume that what this feels like to me is, or that you would welcome." He stopped himself. "I'm not usually this inarticulate." "You are doing well," she said, and she meant it kindly. "Ghorza." He said her name with a weight that was entirely different from the way he usually said it. "I would like to court you, if that is something you would want. If that is something that is possible, given," he gestured vaguely at the space between them, which contained 2 different peoples and a complicated history, and a set of practical challenges that he was clearly cataloging even as he spoke. "I know it is not simple. Nothing worth having is simple," she said. And then, because he was looking at her with an expression so earnest and careful and unguarded that it did the thing to her chest again. "Yes, you may court me, Warren Watkins." The relief that moved through his face was almost funny. "Good," he said. "That is very good." He picked up his cup again, then put it down, then said, "What does courtship look like for Bloodhorn clan?" "Persistent presence," she said. "Gift-giving, but practical gifts, not decorative ones. Demonstrating usefulness." Meeting the clan, she paused. "The last part is the difficult one. I assumed it would be. Are you afraid?" He considered this honestly, which she appreciated. "Of the clan as a whole, somewhat. Of making a fool of myself." "Yes, of you." He looked at her across the table. "Never." Winter came, and Warren Watkins came to the clan hall. He did not arrive empty-handed. He came with 2 months of work represented in the pack he carried, a set of fine iron tools he had traded pelts for at the autumn market, well-balanced and good quality, useful for the clan's leather workers. He came with dried herbs and a block of rendered beeswax for waterproofing, practical items that spoke of someone who had thought carefully about what a clan preparing for winter actually needed. He came with, under his arm, a side of smoked venison he had prepared himself. And he came on foot alone, which was either very brave or very foolish, and which the clan would debate for some weeks. Ghorza met him at the boundary markers. "You found it," she said. "You gave me good directions." "The clan knows you are coming," she said. "I told them last week." He absorbed this. "How was that received?" "With the full range of opinion that I expected," she said. "Some clan members are curious, some are skeptical. Brack thinks I have lost my mind." She paused. "Merva, who is the eldest and whose opinion the clan respects, said to bring you and she would decide for herself." "And you?" She looked at him. He was wearing his gray wool cloak, the same one, and his breath made clouds in the cold air, and he was looking at her with that particular expression of his that she had spent the better part of a year learning to read. "I decided for myself in February," she said, "when I was sitting in your cabin and you handed me a second cup of elderflower tea without asking." The walk to the hall was not long, but she used it to brief him quietly. Names to remember. The ones who would be watching him most closely. The things to say and not say. He listened with complete attention and asked clarifying questions that told her he was genuinely paying attention, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. By the time they reached the hall gates, she felt the knot in her chest loosen somewhat, because she was bringing him into her home and she had wanted to be certain fully, bone-deep certain, that he was worth it, and she was. The reception in the clan hall was exactly what she had predicted, which was a tribute to her knowledge of her people. The clan gathered to see this human man who had come to court their Ghorza, and they assessed him the way Bloodhorn people assessed everything, which was directly and without much ceremony. Brack stood at the back with his arms crossed and his expression carefully antagonistic. The younger hunters clustered in a group with studied casualness. Old Merva sat by the main fire in her carved chair and looked at Warren Watkins with 70 years of practiced human reading behind her eyes. Warren set his gifts on the clan's council table. He named each one and explained its use, which was the correct thing to do, and his voice was steady throughout. He made no grandiose speeches. He did not attempt humor, which was wise. He stood straight and he met eyes when eyes were offered, and he did not flinch from the inspection. And Ghorza watched him with a fierce, quiet pride that she kept entirely off her face. Merva spoke last. She was small for an orc, collapsed inward on herself by age into something dense and compact, with white hair and eyes that had gone pale and keen. She looked at Warren for a long time without speaking, and the hall was very quiet because Merva's opinion settled things. "You gave her your cloak," Merva said. "Yes, Elder," Warren said. "Why?" "Because she needed it and I had it," he said. "And because," he glanced at Ghorza briefly, and the glance said everything that was not in his words, which was that he would have given it to her even if he had only the one coat. It seemed like the right thing to do. Merva made the soft sound that Ghorza had heard in the yard the morning she came home from the blizzard. "Sit down," Merva told him. "You can eat with us." Brack uncrossed his arms. He did not relax them entirely, but he uncrossed them, which was progress. Warren ate dinner with the Bloodhorn clan that evening. He ate what was put in front of him, which included roasted marrow and pickled root vegetables, and a fermented grain dish that was an acquired taste even for orcs, and he ate all of it without visible reluctance, which earned him a nod from the cook, a woman named Drova who did not offer nods lightly. He spoke when spoken to and listened the rest of the time, and he was called upon to describe what he knew of the trade situation in Harrow's Crossing, which he did accurately and usefully, and by the end of the evening, Ghorza could see that the scales of the clan's opinion were settling, if not fully tipped. He left after dinner, before the hour was too late, because he had the walk back to the cabin, and because staying would have been too much too fast, and Ghorza walked him to the boundary markers again. The night was very cold and very clear, the stars brilliant and enormous above them in the way they were only in deep winter, and their breath made twin clouds in the dark. That was he began. Better than expected, she said. Brack, he said. Give him time, she said. He is protective of the clan and of me specifically. He is not a bad person. He simply needs longer to trust than most. I can respect that. He pulled his cloak tighter. He looked up at the stars for a moment and then at her, and in the starlight his face was very clear and still. Ghorza, I want to do this correctly. I want to do it in a way that doesn't cause problems for you or the clan. But I also want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this takes, whatever the pace, whatever is required of me, I'm here. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold moved around them like something living. I know, she said. And then, because it was true and because she was done pretending otherwise, I am glad. She reached out and adjusted his cloak at the collar, because the wind had folded it wrong and it was letting cold in at his neck, and her fingers brushed the line of his jaw and they both went very still for a moment, and she was aware of the warmth of his skin against her fingertips in a way that moved through her like something vast and quiet. Good night, Warren Watkins, she said. Good night, Ghorza Bloodhorn, he said. Spring came again, and with it a new rhythm of meetings at the market, at the boundary markers, sometimes at his cabin when she was hunting the South Ridge, sometimes at the clan hall when the clan's tolerance had warmed enough to make it comfortable. The courtship was slow, which suited both of them. They were not young fools in the grip of sudden infatuation. They were, each of them, careful people who had learned to measure the weight of commitments before making them, and they approached their growing love the way they approached everything else, steadily, methodically, with full attention. But it was love. She knew it was love by the spring, because she had known what love looked like from watching her parents, and what she and Warren had was the same species of thing, recognizable beneath its particular surface differences. It was in the way she listened for his voice before she could see him at the market. It was in the way she found herself constructing arguments in her head that she intended to present to him on topics she knew interested him, because she wanted to hear what he would say in response. It was in the way his opinion on things mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with practicality, and everything to do with the fact that she had come to trust his judgment the way she trusted her own, which was the highest compliment she knew how to pay. She told Merva in the spring. Merva, who had figured it out 6 months earlier, and who was waiting with extraordinary patience for Ghorza to state the obvious. I love him, Ghorza said. They were sitting by Merva's fire in the old woman's private quarters, which smelled of dried herbs and old leather, and the particular warmth of a space that had been lived in for a long time. I intend to partner with him if he is willing. He is willing, Merva said dryly. You cannot know that. I knew it when he ate the fermented grain without making a face, Merva said. A man who wants to leave does not eat things he finds difficult without complaint. A man who wants to stay takes everything offered and says thank you. She looked at Ghorza with those pale, keen eyes. The question is not whether he loves you. The question is whether you have fully considered what this means. I have thought of little else for 2 years, Ghorza said. There are people in this clan who will struggle with it, Merva said. Not most, not for long I think, but some for a while. I know. And in Harrow's Crossing and in the frontier settlements, I know, Ghorza said again. There will be difficulty. There has always been difficulty. My father used to say that the worth of a thing was not measured by how easy it was to achieve. She paused, and that difficulty was not a reason to surrender something good. Merva was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father was a wise chief and a wise man, and you are his daughter in every way that matters. She reached out and patted Ghorza's hand with her own old, scarred one. Go tell that human of yours, stop making him wait. She told him at the autumn market, 3 years after a blizzard had driven her into his cabin and his life. They were sitting by the river that ran behind Harrow's Crossing, where she had asked him to walk with her after the day's trading was done and the market had quieted. The evening was golden and cooling, the leaves going orange on the far bank, and the river made its steady, unremarkable sound against the stones. "I want to be with you properly," she said. "Not as an acquaintance or a courtship or a careful arrangement, as a partner." As your she paused because the human word felt strange in her mouth and the orcish word was not something she was going to use without knowing if he understood it. "My people have a word," she said. "Grucka, it means the one who keeps the fire, the one who tends what matters, the one whose absence makes the hall cold." He looked at her. He had gone very still in the way he went still when something was significant, and his gray-brown eyes were serious and warm. "Yes," he said. "Ghorza, yes. You understand what I am asking. You're asking me to be yours and to let you be mine," he said, "in whatever form that takes, for as long as we're both here." He turned toward her fully on the riverbank, and she was struck again, as she was regularly struck, by the particular quality of his attention when it was entirely on her, as if she were the most important thing in the specific portion of the world that he occupied. "I have been wanting to ask you the same thing for most of a year," he said. "I was waiting until I was certain it was what you wanted." "You waited for me," she said. "Of course I did," he said. "Some things are worth waiting for." She reached out and took his hand, which was something she had not done before, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat by the river in the golden evening, while the water made its ancient, patient sound, and she thought that this was what it felt like when something you had been hoping for very carefully finally became real. The question of where they would live was practical and required actual thought, which they gave it together, spending most of the following winter working through the arrangements. The cabin on the southern ridge was his, and she would not ask him to leave it, but she also could not simply abandon her position and responsibilities to the clan. In the end, they arrived at a solution that was neither entirely his world nor entirely hers, but something built between them, which seemed appropriate. He moved closer. He found a section of land on the southeastern border of Bloodhorn territory, close enough to the clan hall that she could fulfill her duties and close enough to Harrow's Crossing that he could maintain his trade connections, and he built a new cabin there over the course of the spring and summer. He built it with the same care he had applied to his original cabin, but larger 2 rooms, with proper stone floors and a chimney designed for the heavy winters, and a covered woodshed, and a small barn for 2 goats, because Ghorza had strong opinions about goat's milk cheese that he had come to share. Several Bloodhorn clan members helped with the building, which was the first genuinely cooperative project between the clan and a human settler in living memory, and which old Merva observed from a camp chair at a respectful distance, with the expression of someone watching the world arrange itself more sensibly than it had been arranged before. Brack helped with the roof. He did not do this graciously or without commentary, but he did it, and when the cabin was finished he stood back and looked at it and said, roughly, "It is a solid roof," which was, for Brack, essentially a declaration of blessing. They were bonded in the clan hall the following spring, with Bloodhorn ceremony, which involved the exchange of practical vows in front of the clan fire, and the breaking of bread that had been made with grain from each of their households, and the burning of a carved piece of wood that represented the old life being offered to the new one. Warren had asked, carefully and respectfully, what the ceremony entailed, and had prepared for it with the same methodical attention he applied to everything, and when the time came he spoke his vows in a clear voice, and looked at Ghorza the whole time with an expression that made the younger girls in the clan sigh, and that made several of the older hunters find it suddenly necessary to look at the ceiling. Ghorza wore the gray wool cloak for the walk to the hall that morning. She had kept it these 3 years, though she had her own cold-weather cloak and had no practical need for it. She had kept it because it smelled like him, and because it was the first thing he had ever given her, and because she was, beneath all the practicality and the negotiator's composure and the Bloodhorn dignity, a person who treasured the things that mattered. She wore it into the hall and she dared anyone to comment, and no one did, because by now the story of the cloak was known to the entire clan and had taken on the quality of a small clan legend, which she found mildly embarrassing and Warren found entirely delightful. The life they built was not without difficulty. There were human settlers in the Grayville Valley who looked at the partnership with expressions she had cataloged and learned to ignore. There was a winter 2 years into their life in the new cabin when a group of young men from the lower settlements threw stones at the cabin's shutters in the night, and Warren went out to speak with them, and whatever he said, she never entirely learned the details was sufficient, because it did not happen again. There was the ongoing business of clan politics, which was complicated and exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with Warren, but in which he was occasionally a complicating factor simply by existing. And there were long negotiations and careful conversations, and the slow, incremental work of convincing people on both sides that what she and Warren had was not a provocation, but a point of possibility. But there were also the mornings, which were extraordinary. She had not expected the mornings to be what they were. She had known she loved him and had known he was kind, and had known their life would be built on the right foundations. But she had not known, until she was living it, what it felt like to wake before dawn in the cabin they had made together and hear him already at the fire, already heating water for the day's tea, already present and quiet and tending what mattered. She had not known how much that would do to her every single morning, consistently, without diminishing. She had not known that love, when it was the real and daily kind, was so ordinary and so enormous at the same time. Their son was born in the spring 2 years after the bonding ceremony, and he was the most startling creature Ghorza had ever seen, which was remarkable given that she had seen quite a few remarkable things. He was born with his father's angular features softened by orcish roundness, with a faint greenish cast to his skin that grew more pronounced as he aged, with tiny promise nubs at his lower jaw that would be proper bloodhorn tusks in time, and with his father's gray-brown eyes. He was, both his parents felt, completely unreasonably beautiful, which is what most new parents feel about their children, and which was, in this case, empirically verified by Merva, who held him the day after he was born and declared him a fine child, which from Merva was essentially a superlative. They named him Durak Warren, for Ghorza's father and for his own, which felt right. Brack, who had reached a state of grudging genuine respect for Warren over the 2 years of their life in the border cabin, held the baby with the extravagant caution of a large man who had never previously held an infant, and looked at the small half-forked face with the child's gray-brown eyes looking back at him, and said, after a long moment, "He has your eyes, Warren." "He has Ghorza's jaw," Warren said. "He does," Brack said, and there was something in his voice that was unguarded and warm in a way he could not quite prevent, and which he immediately covered by handing the child back with excessive speed and going to find something important to do elsewhere. Merva died the following winter, which was a grief that Ghorza carried for a long time. The old woman went quietly, in her own bed, in her own quarters with the clan around her, and she left behind a space that was irreplaceable in the way that only truly significant presences are. Ghorza sat with her in the last hours, and in those last hours Merva opened her pale eyes once and looked at Ghorza with full and clear attention and said, "It turned out well." "Yes," Ghorza said, "it did." "Your father would be pleased," Merva said, and then she slept and did not wake again. Durak Warren called Duri by everyone, which he accepted with the pragmatic equanimity that was somehow the perfect blend of both his parents grew into a loud, curious, intensely energetic child, who was equally comfortable in the clan hall and in his father's trap lines, and who navigated both worlds with an unself-consciousness that was both enviable and instructive. He was, in some ways, the most useful argument for what his parents had built, because he was simply himself half-orc, half-human, rooted in both places and afraid of neither, and people who saw him were confronted with a living refutation of the idea that the two peoples could not coexist. He was 4 years old when his sister arrived, born in high summer with the windows of the cabin open to the warm night, with the smell of growing things everywhere and her father holding her mother's hand so tightly throughout the labor that Ghorza had to remind him, once or twice, to breathe. The girl came out fighting, which the midwife, an orcish woman named Helda who had attended perhaps 100 births, said was a very good sign. She was darker than her brother, her skin a deep green closer to her mother's, with a mass of black hair and tusks that were already at birth, notably more pronounced than Duri's had been. She had her mother's amber eyes, luminous and sharp. Mara, Ghorza said when the baby was in her arms because the name had been waiting, her grandmother's name. Mara Bloodhorn Watkins. Warren, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been entirely unhelpful throughout a demanding process and knows it, looked at his daughter's amber eyes and said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "She's extraordinary." "She is," Ghorza agreed. He looked up at her. He looked at her with those gray-brown riverstone eyes, and everything that they had built and made and been to each other was in that look, layered and deep and full of the kind of feeling that only comes from years of actual living, not from the first bright fire of early love, but from what that fire becomes when it is tended properly, something steadier and warmer and more sustaining. "Ghorza," he said, and her name in his voice was still the same as it had always been, that particular weight and warmth. "Thank you, for what specifically?" she said. "For walking toward the sound of an axe in a blizzard," he said. "For coming to my door, for drinking the tea." She laughed, which made the baby stir in her arms. "You gave me wool socks," she said. "Without asking, that is when I knew you were worth keeping." "The socks," he said. "The socks," she confirmed. He reached over and covered her hand with his, the one not holding Mara, and she felt his warmth against her skin. And outside the window the summer night was full of the sounds of living things, and the clan hall was not far, and the cabin they had built together had its fire going low and warm in the next room, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Duri grew into a young man of uncommon quality. He was, at 15, already something of an ambassador by temperament, moving between the human settlement in Harrow's Crossing and the Bloodhorn clan with an ease that still occasionally startled people who were not accustomed to seeing it. He had his father's patience and his mother's directness, and a gift for finding the thing that two different people had in common before they had found it themselves. He was going to be, Ghorza thought, the kind of person who made the world better simply by being in it, which was the most she could wish for any child. Mara was a different creature, entirely fiercer and more inward, deeply devoted to the clan's traditions, learning the older ways of hunting and craft and ceremony with an intensity that reminded Ghorza of herself at that age. She wore her orcish heritage like armor, not out of defensiveness but out of genuine pride, and she had her grandmother Durak's quality of absolute stillness when she was thinking, and her father's gray-brown eyes in her amber-eyed face, which was a combination that made her look permanently and effectively like she knew things other people did not. Warren's hair went gray at the temples when he was in his late 30s, which Ghorza found, to her own amusement, deeply appealing. He was still lean and still strong from a life of physical work, though the trap lines had been supplemented in recent years by a small trading operation that he ran in partnership with Aldrich Brent's son, because the frontier was changing, not dramatically, but certainly, and there was opportunity in the change for people willing to work at the borders of things. The scar through his eyebrow had been joined by a few more lines on his face, the kind that came from weather and laughter and years, and she had mapped every one of them with her fingers over the course of their life together in the way that only long love permits. She was 37 when she became the clan's chief negotiator by formal appointment, which was the role she had effectively held for a decade, but which now required formal recognition following the retirement of old Drova's son, who had held the title without much conviction, and everyone knew it. The appointment gave her official standing in treaty negotiations with the human frontier settlements, which had expanded and consolidated in the years since the blizzard, and which had moved slowly, grudgingly, with occasional setbacks towards something that was more genuinely cooperative than the old truce. Warren stood with her at the appointment ceremony in the clan hall, which was unusual. Human partners of clan members attended ceremonies, certainly, but usually at the edges, with the respectful distance that maintained the form of things. He stood beside her at the fire because she wanted him there, and because she had stopped, years ago, asking permission for the things that were simply true, and the clan gathered around them with the familiar, grounded weight of people who knew both of them well and had made their peace with what they were to each other. Brack, who was now old enough to have softened into something resembling grace, stood at the front of the clan and said, "Ghorza Bloodhorn has been the voice of this clan in the world beyond our fire for 10 years, and she has spoken well. Today we name it what it already is." He looked at her, and then at Warren, and for a moment his expression was something she had never quite seen from him before, not grudging respect or suspicious tolerance or any of the shades of the long journey they had made from the morning she came home in a human cloak, but something simpler and more complete. "The clan is glad of you both," he said. "Whatever I said at the beginning, and I said foolish things, the clan is glad." She looked at her cousin, this big, difficult, protective man who had stood at the back of rooms with his arms crossed and slowly, year by year, uncrossed them. She said, "Thank you, Brack. I know it cost you something to say that." "Everything worth saying costs something," he said, which was, for Brack, a remarkable philosophical observation, and drew a muffled sound of amusement from somewhere behind her that she recognized as Warren suppressing a laugh, and she suppressed one of her own. The peace treaty between Harrow's Crossing and the Bloodhorn clan was formally negotiated the following spring, replacing the old truce document with something that had actual substance: trade guarantees, land use agreements, shared responsibilities for the forest roads that both communities depended on, and a provision for a joint market held on neutral ground that would operate 3 times a year. It was Ghorza's work, principally, drafted over the winter in long sessions at the clan hall table with Warren bringing tea and occasionally offering opinions that she sometimes used and sometimes rejected, but always found useful to test her own thinking against. The human delegation from Harrow's Crossing was led by a man named Rowan Aldrich, who was Aldrich Brent's son and Warren's trading partner, and who had grown up watching Warren and Ghorza's partnership from close range, and who approached the negotiation with a genuine willingness that made Ghorza's job considerably easier than it might have been. When the treaty was signed, at a table set up in the neutral ground between the clan boundary and the Harrow's Crossing Market Square, Rowan Aldrich shook Ghorza's hand and said, "I think we should have done this 20 years ago." "We were not ready 20 years ago," Ghorza said. "People need time." "Your husband has been making this argument at the market for 15 years, Rowan said. "He is persuasive," Ghorza said, and looked at Warren, who was standing at the edge of the gathering with the air of someone trying to be unobtrusive and not entirely succeeding, because he was tall and people tended to notice him. He caught her eye and did the small, crooked smile that had done things to her composure since the first time she saw it, and she turned back to Rowan Aldrich with the negotiator's composure that was also, underneath, a kind of joy. The years that followed the treaty were full in the way that lives are full when the foundational things are right and the world is, at least in your particular corner of it, moving toward better. There were still difficulties. There were still frontier storms that tested the cabin's walls and cold winters, that tested the stores and political disputes between the clan and the settlement that tested Ghorza's patience and diplomatic reserves. There were the ordinary griefs, the loss of Ghorza's older cousin Marga, who had been one of her closest friends in the clan, and the injury Warren sustained one winter in his late 40s when a tree he was felling came down wrong and broke his forearm, and the months of healing that followed, during which he was spectacularly bad at resting, and she was spectacularly firm about making him do it. But the winters in the cabin together. The long summer evenings by the fire when both children were grown, and the world had settled into its comfortable order. The autumn markets when she watched Warren talk to merchants and trappers and settlers who had known him for 20 years, and who trusted him the way people trusted someone whose word had never failed them. The mornings, always the mornings, with the tea already hot when she woke. Dury bonded with a young woman from Harrow's Crossing named Sira when he was 22, a farmer's daughter, dark-haired and cheerful, who had grown up hearing about the Bloodhorn trapper's son, and who had clearly decided on meeting him that everything she had heard was insufficient. The bonding ceremony was held partly in the clan hall and partly in the Harrow's Crossing church, accommodating both sets of customs, and both communities came, and it was, Ghorza thought, one of the better days she could remember. She watched her son and his human bride at the clan hall fire, the same fire where she and Warren had made their own vows, and she felt the continuity of it like a thread running through her life, connecting the blizzard and the cloak and the elderflower tea, and all the years between to this moment and forward into the years she would not see but could imagine. Mara did not bond until she was 26, and then she chose a Bloodhorn clan hunter named Ghor who had the same fierce inwardness she had and who was, everyone agreed, her exact match in ways that were occasionally frightening and generally excellent. They settled in the clan hall, as was Bloodhorn tradition, and Mara took up a role in the clan's governance that was already, at 26, formidably competent. She was going to be a chief someday, Ghorza thought, and felt the specific, complicated pride of watching something you have shaped go beyond you. Warren was 51 when he stopped doing the trap lines, not because he was incapable, but because his trading operation had grown to a point where it was the more demanding work, and because Dury had taken over the lines with the systematic competence that characterized everything he did. He spent more time at the cabin, more time at the joint market that had now been running for a dozen years, more time with Ghorza, and she found, with the same kind of surprised pleasure that she had found things all along their life together, that having more of his time was not something she had adjusted to or grown used to, but something that continued to be, every day, a thing she was glad of. On the evening of the 15th anniversary of their bonding ceremony, he built a fire in the outdoor pit they had made in the cabin yard years ago, the broad, flat-stoned ring surrounded by good log seats that the family used on warm summer evenings, and he made dinner over it, roasted rabbit and vegetables from the garden Ghorza had always maintained with rather more success than she had initially expected, and bread baked that afternoon and the elderflower tea that was still, as it had always been, a point of mild and affectionate contention between them. The children were not there that evening. This was arranged, she suspected, by some coordination between Warren and Dury, who shared a gift for quiet logistics. The evening was their own, and it was warm, and the light came down golden through the trees around the cabin yard the way it did in late summer in the foothills, and she sat across the fire from Warren Watkins, and looked at his graying hair and his scarred eyebrow and his river-stone eyes, and felt the weight and fullness of what they had made together with a clarity that was almost overwhelming. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about a blizzard," she said. He smiled. "I think about that blizzard a great deal." "I was terrified," she said, which she had never quite said in those terms before. "I know," he said. "I could tell, but you walked toward the sound anyway." "You were making a great deal of noise with that axe," she said. He laughed. "Is that your version of why we're sitting here?" "You split wood loudly," she said. "It was audible even over the wind. I thought, at least this particular danger is making itself clearly known." "I'm glad I was making noise," he said. He looked at her across the fire, and his expression was the one she had mapped the most carefully over the years, the one that was entirely unguarded, entirely her. "I'm glad you came to the door. I'm glad I opened it." "You were going to offer me tea regardless," she said. "Of course," he said. The wool socks were a calculated risk. They were excellent wool socks, she said. They were the best socks I owned, he said. I want you to know that. I gave you the best socks I had. She looked at him. The fire moved between them, orange and steady. The forest beyond the cabin yard was full of evening sounds, birds settling, leaves moving, the creek at the bottom of the ridge making its old, patient argument with the stones. I know, she said. I have always known. They sat by the fire until the summer dark came down around them, and she thought about the word her people used, Grucka, the one who keeps the fire, and about how it was not only a metaphor, or not entirely. Warren Watkins had kept a literal fire going on the worst night of a blizzard for a stranded orc woman he had never met, and had kept the broader fire going every day since, in all the ways that mattered. He had tended the things between them with the same steadiness and patience with which he had always approached the difficult work of the world, and she had done the same for him, and the thing they had built was warm and solid and real in the way that only enduring things are. The gray wool cloak still hung on a peg inside the cabin door, though it was too worn now to wear outdoors. She had asked him once whether they should retire it, replace it, and he had said, with a straightness that was entirely sincere, "That cloak is not going anywhere." And she had felt the same thing she had felt the day he held it out to her in the white storm, that here was a person who understood what things meant and honored them accordingly. Dury had 3 children eventually, a boy and then twin girls, all of them that improbable, beautiful mixture of their grandmother's green and their grandfather's lines, with eyes that were either gray-brown or amber depending on the angle of the light. Mara had 2 both fierce, both purely orcish in their bones, which was entirely right. The grandchildren were a fact of life that Ghorza had understood intellectually, but not, she discovered, emotionally, until the first one arrived and she held a small, warm, living proof of everything the years had been for. Warren held that first grandchild and looked at her with an expression she had seen before only once, on a summer night 20-some years past when he held their own daughter for the first time, and she understood then that some capacities do not diminish with repetition but grow deeper, and that this was one of them. "He looks like Dury at this age," Warren said. "He looks like you," Ghorza said. "The eyebrows." Warren looked at the small, sleeping face with its fine dark brows. "The eyebrows," he said, and there was such wonder in his voice, such uncomplicated, unhidden joy, that she felt her own chest full to a degree that was not entirely comfortable, and she did not attempt to moderate it, because she had learned a long time ago that the moments when feeling overcame composure were not weaknesses but confirmations. The joint market between Bloodhorn Clan and Harrow's Crossing was in its 20th year when the Frontier Council of the Wider Valley asked Ghorza to speak at their annual gathering about the model they had developed, which was being cited in disputes across the region as an example of workable cooperation. She accepted. She wrote her address over the winter at the cabin table, and Warren read the drafts and offered the measured, useful commentary she had relied on for 2 decades. And on the day she rode to the Valley Council Hall and stood before delegates from 7 different frontier settlements and 3 different orc clans, she spoke plainly and without ornamentation about the things she knew to be true. She said that cooperation was not a diplomatic abstraction, but a practical arrangement between actual people with actual needs, and that it worked when those people were given reasons to trust each other rather than reasons to fear each other. She said that she had spent her adult life working at the border between 2 peoples, and that the border was not a line but a place, and that places could be inhabited and tended the same as any other ground. She said that what they had in the Grayville foothills had not come easily or quickly, and that it had required people on both sides who were willing to be patient and to be wrong and to keep showing up. And she said, because it was true, and because she had decided that honesty was more useful than strategy at the level of things she was now being asked to address, that the whole of it had started with a blizzard and a gray wool cloak and a human man who opened his door, and that she thought the lesson in that was simpler than the diplomats tended to make it. That sometimes what was required was simply the willingness to extend warmth toward someone cold, without condition, without calculation, and to trust that warmth, given freely, came back. She came home from the Valley Council to the cabin that smelled like wood smoke and pine, and Warren was at the fire with 2 cups already made, and their youngest grandchild was asleep on a pallet in the corner under a blanket Mara had made, because Dury and his wife were in Harrow's Crossing for the night and had asked if the little one could stay. "How was it?" Warren asked. "They listened," she said. "Of course they listened," he said. "You're worth listening to." She sat down across from him and took her cup, and the fire was warm between them, and the small child breathed softly in the corner, and outside the window the night was clear and full of stars. "I said something about you," she told him. "Good things, I hope." "I said you opened your door," she said. He looked at her. "I had wool socks," he said. "It would have been wrong to keep them to myself." She laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind she had always been most comfortable with him, the kind that did not require performance or management, and it filled the cabin the way warmth filled the cabin, completely, all the way into the corners. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had on the riverbank at the autumn market all those years ago when she had said yes, and he had said yes, and the word had settled into the ground like a seed. His hands had more years in them now, more lines and weather, and hers did too, and the grip was the same, steady, certain. His. "Thank you," she said, "not for anything specific, for all of it." "Thank you," he said, "not for anything specific, for all of it." Outside the window, the stars were the same stars they had always been, the ones that hung above the Ashpeak Range and the Grayville foothills and the Clan Hall and the cabin and the boundary markers and the market square and Harrow's Crossing, unchanged and indifferent and immeasurably old, shining down equally on all of it, on the old gray cloak on its peg and the fire and the sleeping child and the 2 people at the table with their hands linked, and their lives fully, completely, irrevocably made. It was enough. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.